there have been some major opinion shifts with me in the Mediterranean diet. Now, you've followed me for a while. You know that I am a proponent of a Mediterranean diet and lifestyle, whether it's applied with a lower carb approach or a traditional moderate carb approach. I think the fundamentals are great, but after living in the Mediterranean for about a month, I know it's not a long time, but I recognize some things. Now, full disclaimer, I did live in Italy when I was a kid. Okay, but at that time, I was a kid. I was a teenager, and I probably didn't appreciate things and lifestyle and dietary approaches like I do now. So going back there, it was like, okay, all of a sudden I see this. Now, full disclaimer, what you see in a short period of time is not the same as when you're fully immersed there. And also, full disclaimer, the Mediterranean diet isn't necessarily suggesting that European lifestyle is the Mediterranean diet, right? There's a lot of processed food now in Europe. There's a lot of garbage coming in too. But make no mistake, the EU doesn't really allow a lot of food import coming from the US. And they probably don't allow that for good reason, okay? Because some of their stuff in the US, as you know, is probably, Anyway, first and foremost, the thing that I changed my opinion on the most, it seems to me that the defined eating periods and the sizes of the meals are probably one of the biggest things with the Mediterranean diet. So if you were to try to take exactly what Europe does, exactly what the Mediterranean does, and put it in the US, I firmly believe, and I cannot say this with scientific literature and evidence, but I firmly do believe that if you didn't have the timing system down and the structure of the meals and the size of the meals down, it wouldn't work the same. I noticed that lunch seems to be the biggest meal, at least the region that I was in. Light breakfast, then it was a pretty large lunch with fairly decent carbohydrates stacked at lunch, and then a relatively late dinner, which was surprising to me given all the evidence on like late dinner and sleep, but it wasn't a huge dinner. Okay, so it was like light breakfast was almost like croissant, maybe some kind of cured meat or something, and an espresso or something like that. It was like really small. Then lunch seemed to be bigger. That just flew in the face of what I thought was Mediterranean, because I thought the Mediterranean was like the eat breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, dinner like a pauper, since we conditioned ourselves to believe that's the best metabolically. Now, scientifically, big breakfast, moderate lunch, small dinner does seem to be slightly the best. But it's interesting, because in most of the Mediterranean, they eat dinner pretty late, and it doesn't seem to impact their longevity. But then again, it's a different lifestyle, different food altogether. The second thing that I've had a very big shift on, and this is something that I've been slowly shifting my perspective on over the last couple of years, but then it really just sealed the deal. There's a respectful amount of meat consumption. And I want to put this out there because I think that what we see the Mediterranean diet as and what the real Mediterranean diet is are two completely different things. Now, I'd love to hear your opinions in the comments if you live in the Mediterranean. I do read those. I do pay attention to those. So if you live in the Mediterranean, give me your insight here. Because I did not see any inclination that there was like limited meat consumption. There was not an over-obsession with it, but I was surprised, and I actually saw more red meat and more cured meat than I thought. You see, if you look at the Mediterranean diet on paper and how I've kind of viewed it for a long time, it's like poultry, fish, kind of the staples. But I actually saw people eating decent amounts of cured meat and red meat and eggs as sort of their sources, and actually had a harder time, this may be just me and where I was, I had a harder time finding like leaner chicken sources. I would find like full, possibly breaded chicken sources. But is that Mediterranean diet, or is that just locale, right? One thing we also have to understand and respect is that the Mediterranean diet is vast. What they do in Greece versus what they do in Italy versus Sardinia versus even Sicily versus Spain versus South France, right? It's all going to be slightly different with different customs. But the third thing I noticed, and this was actually the biggest shock to me, was there was a tremendous emphasis on dairy fat and dairy protein. Lots of butter, lots of cream, lots of high-fat, full-fat yogurt, lots of cottage cheese, lots of even protein that is derived from milk, right? So it was like ultra-filtered milk. I did another video where I talked about this, like ultra-filtered milk, to make it high protein. So in the US, what I find interesting, and this is not to rain on any of these companies, no way, shape, or form, it's just an observation. We have things like Fairlife, we have things like these muscle milks and these RTD protein milk drinks where it's milk plus whey protein or casein protein to spike the protein. And then over there, I didn't find those very often. What I found was ultra filtered milk that would have higher amounts of milk protein. Now, to cite some interesting evidence, there is strong literature that actually milk protein is a superior protein because you have the casein proteins and you have the whey proteins, full spectrum protein in its entire food matrix. We view milk protein as low quality in the US, whereas in the Mediterranean, there was actually a solid recognition of that being great. Now, what's interesting is when you look at the fatty acid profile of dairy fat, you also realize it's very pro-longevity. I talked about this before, but in Sardinia and their Pecorino Romano consumption, high amounts of good quality aged saturated fat from cheese. Why this was shocking to me was I even put in I authored a book called The New Mediterranean Diet about 7 years ago with Dr. Nick Norwitz and a couple others. And a lot of our emphasis really was on the fact that it was a moderately low saturated fat diet, higher poly, higher monounsaturated fats, which is not totally incorrect. But I almost died on that hill of being like, no, it's relatively low saturated fat. And I started seeing a lot of people combat that. Be like, no, it depends what region you're in. Like there are regions that are lower saturated fat, but a lot of regions are higher saturated fat. I was surprised to see the amount of saturated fat consumption in the Mediterranean. It's changed and altered how I view that. It's not just about how much can we possibly cram olive oil in. It really was a thoughtful use. There was a lot more butter use than there was, say, soybean oil or cooking spray. Like things were just cooked in butter or cooked in cream, and it wasn't like a huge deal. And it wasn't ridiculous portions of it. And when you look at the scientific evidence, dairy fat with the CLA, the myristic acid, and of course the C15, which is showing to be very powerful, really good stuff. Number 5, there was less starch than I was expecting. Now, I remember when I was a kid going to school in Italy, I do remember the starches being different and the servings being smaller. I remember coming from the US where it was like refined packaged bread and like top ramen, coming here and being like, okay, coming to Europe and being like, okay, this is different. Like you have a pizza and it's thin and it's actually the carb load is actually not what people would think. I very well have to admit that I could be entirely wrong with this. But what I noticed is like northern Italy, much more like rice-based, things like that. As you work your way further south, it was a little bit more pasta-based. South France was a little bit less like starches in general and a little bit more like, okay, maybe there's some focus on good quality bread, right? Along with some more proteins. It was very interesting. It changed dramatically, but it was less starchy than I thought. If anything, for an American going there, it was more obscure, weird things, right? Like some eggplant and this and that, like different combinations or interesting ways to eat fish and interesting ways to eat chicken with lots of good rich sauces that were more fat, monounsaturated fat based. So it wasn't like just pasta everywhere. And I think that that is not something I've changed my perspective on because I've kind of known that, but I think it's important that people know what the real Mediterranean diet is versus what we might play it up to be in the US. Like it's not just this massive staple of carbohydrates as the base. I would say if anything, it's a little bit more like polyphenols, like vegetables, and maybe dairy as a base, and then kind of going up from there. Maybe starch is next. Truthfully, it's not hard to eat Mediterranean style in the US in terms of basic function, but where it gets hard is we do tend in the US to lack the nutrient quality. And this is not a naturalistic fallacy. Naturalistic fallacy is essentially coming from Darwinism, where you're basically saying like, oh, okay, well, as long as it's close to the earth, as long as it's natural, it's good and it's gonna be powerful and it's natural selection that way, where if we move away from that. Not what I'm saying. Not what I'm saying. I'm saying that nutrient quality matters for satiety, it matters for potentially GLP-1 activation, it matters for a number of things. And if you think fundamentally, like if our brains are getting the signal that we have adequate nutrition, adequate minerals, we're gonna be less likely to have weird, obscure hunger signals that are coming out of left field from random things. Okay, so if you tried to eat traditional Mediterranean style in the US, it would come with a lot of difficult periods. You'd probably be more hungry. We also don't have the lifestyle that works along with it, with lots of walking, things like that. Not saying don't do it. I think that the more that we can adopt that kind of life and those principles with nutrition, the foundational ones, the better. Okay, I put a link down below for Thrive Market because they have the ability to search for like Mediterranean options. It's a 30% off discount link for grocery shopping through Thrive Market. So if you go up to their search bar and you type in Mediterranean, you can find all kinds of foods that fit like a Mediterranean diet sort of profile. If you went to the grocery store, you'd be jumping all over the place trying to find things that fit looking at labels, saying, nope, that is soybean oil, this is that. Thrive Market already does the work for you, which is why they have sponsored this channel for, my gosh, it's like going on a decade now. Like they've been a sponsor for a very long time because I support what they do, they support what I do, and it makes sense for my audience and people that are watching my channels like you. So that link is down below. It's 30% off your entire first grocery order and a $60 free gift. And then everything gets delivered and shipped to your doorstep. You open it up and you've got even sustainable meat and seafood options that are frozen. They have fresh stuff starting to roll out for some members, so like cottage cheese and stuff like that, but it's not for everyone yet. And then of course they have the package type stuff, which doesn't have the typical garbage that would be in the grocery store packaged stuff. So that link is down below. Number 6 is really interesting. I ignored the fact that with a Mediterranean diet, bread was going to be a part of it. I think for me, coming from years of being very overweight and obese, and then losing weight with a low carb diet, I had blinders on that like all bread was bad. Okay, and make no mistake, I don't think that we should willy-nilly go out and eat a bunch of bread. I don't, but I definitely lived with blinders on. Like in the Mediterranean regions, there is a nice emphasis on sourdough, a nice emphasis on a baguette, on good quality bread. But what I've noticed there, and I really did look hard for this, and I looked hard because it was interesting to me, that a region that was relatively slim with low BMI, active, healthy, good longevity, what they did differently with their bread consumption. There wasn't a ridiculous amount of bread consumption, and the demand for fresh bread was very high. If it wasn't fresh bread, I noticed that it wasn't like top tier, wasn't wanted, wasn't like that qualified to be in the diet as much. Don't get me wrong, packaged bread was definitely there, lots of processed bread. And I wasn't sitting there studying a grocery store, watching everybody that came out of the store and how much bread they were buying. But what I did notice is that there was a strong emphasis on eating the fresh stuff. And when there's a demand for fresh daily bread and sourdough, you have a different level of gliadin. So you have less of the potential gluten that could be problematic, but you also just overall have a demand for something that just, you can't have that much coming in every day. So it's a reasonable amount of bread consumption, and it's probably, I'll go out on a limb and say it's probably healthier. Number 7, the Mediterranean regions eat locally sourced. Okay, we've talked about this so many times on my channel, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself and you've watched something that mentions this, but in the US we import constantly. In the EU, they don't really have to import as much because they have different regions within the EU and they can cross over those treated as domestic borders for each country line. So there's a lot of variety and it can still be relatively locally sourced. But in the specific coastal Mediterranean regions, there's a lot of locally sourced stuff. And you find restaurants have a lot more locally sourced stuff. And the markets have more locally sourced stuff. I think A, that puts a limit on the consumption to a certain degree, but B, you're also probably having better quality stuff that's not oxidized. So that's one thing that, again, when I look at the Mediterranean diet and we do it in America, it's like it's a fraction of what you're really getting in the real deal. So how do I combat that? Well, if I could, I'd try to tailor my Mediterranean approach to what's in season in my given region. Number 8, overall, it's actually lower fat than I expected. There's so much emphasis, and rightfully so. Please don't get me wrong. There's rightfully so an emphasis on the good quality fats in the Mediterranean. Lots of olive oil, lots of good healthy fats, right? Good polyunsaturated fats in moderate amounts, good monounsaturated fats, high amounts of fish consumption, shellfish consumption. The fatty acid profile is great. High omega-3s, right? What I was expecting and what I didn't remember from when I lived there as a kid is that things aren't doused in olive oil. It's not swimming in it. What it is that the actual profile of fats is better. So it's not 60% fat. It's still probably 30% fat. It's lower fat than I expected. But the ratio of those fats is much better. It's more like predominantly butter, predominantly dairy fat, and monounsaturated fats, then some polyunsaturated fats, and then the refined oils down below that. So it was like a saturated fat, monounsaturated fat on the bottom of the pyramid, followed by maybe the whole nuts and the fish, followed by the refined oils. So big difference from what we would think, where it's just like tons of fats, all olive oil, right? Anyway, the next one that I think people overlook because they don't think of it as diet. Coffee consumption is very high there, very high in the Mediterranean regions. Caffeine consumption is arguably quite high. Isn't that bad? I don't, first of all, think caffeine is bad. The evidence suggests that caffeine prevents frailty. There was a recent study in 2024 suggested this. It was like people that consume more caffeine actually had less frailty as they got older because they're more active. Yeah, if you have a cup of coffee and you can get up and walk around and preserve your muscle because you're using it versus not having a cup of coffee and not having an impetus to stand up off the couch, duh, right? Movement, stimulus, it's everything. So I don't have an issue with coffee. What's interesting is that in the United States, a cup of coffee is the largest concentration of antioxidants that most Americans are getting in a day. So perhaps the coffee consumption, the tea consumption, it's an antioxidant powerhouse. So I overlooked that. I looked at it from, yes, it's a very European thing to do. But what I didn't factor in is, hey, this has a place in the Mediterranean approach. Just like certain wines, like in Sardinia, like aged wines, can have an approach, right? Like have a place. Not overconsumption of those wines. And that's another thing I noticed is that the wine consumption is not nearly as much as I thought. And the polyphenols were high, but not as ridiculous. We'll talk about that in a minute. The coffee consumption definitely seems important. From a polyphenol, from a chlorogenic acid side, from the caffeine side, you name it. The next thing I noticed, and the final thing that I'll mention here today, and this is a huge one, I think that we put too much emphasis on fiber with a Mediterranean diet, when in reality, it wasn't as high fiber as I thought, but it was nutrient dense and polyphenol and flavonol rich. Polyphenols act as a potent fiber within the gut. They are a prebiotic that is exceptionally strong, stronger than soluble fibers and other insoluble fibers. They're a unique type of fiber. And because the nutrient quality and polyphenol content is so rich, I noticed that it wasn't like there was added flax, added chia seeds. There wasn't this like heavy plant-based fiber is king thought process. It actually was just never really a thing. It was just like you're eating good whole foods that are getting you enough fiber, but you have enough fats and protein that you're satiated. I just don't think that the fiber is put on a pedestal like it is in the United States. And this is coming from a guy that actually likes fiber. I consume fiber because it kills my appetite. I consume fiber because it's a GLP-1 activator. I eat fiber because it has a huge gut effect. But I notice that in the Mediterranean, it's sort of an Americanized thing to say that the Mediterranean prioritizes fiber. They're not sitting there being like, I need my fiber, I need my fiber. They just eat good polyphenol-rich foods that are good for their gut. And probably the most important thing, there's a focus on quality of life. And there's a lot of people out there, a lot of very smart scientists, you name it, that agree that our brains pave the way for everything that happens down here. So that thought process of living life first and kind of work second, as much as I am a hardworking, candidly capitalist, I feel that we could learn something from how they live their lives. As always, keep it locked here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.